Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. As a podcast dedicated to the history of video games, you can imagine, Player One, just how close to our hearts today's topic is going to be for us. Emulation. Even if our home consoles have long bitten the dust, it gives us a chance to play our childhood favorites once more, and a lot of the time with better graphics, more features, and extra content. So, welcome to the history of emulation.
So, JP, what was your first exposure to emulation?
Well, emulation has exposed itself to me in the form of a CD given
Sure.
to me by my cousin. I got the CD. He didn't actually give it to me directly. Like, he gave the CD to my aunt, and then the aunt gave it to me, and she was like, "Oh, hey, this is a CD from your cousin Robert. I don't know what it is."
Okay.
And yeah, just I hope you enjoy it because I don't know what's going on. I just read it and I was like, it just said like SNES ROMs on it. And I was like, huh, what's this?
Oh, it's a virus.
Yeah, probably, yeah. Because my cousin's always giving me viruses. But I put it in my PC, and at first I didn't even know what to do with it because I was like, okay, there's like, there's like file and edit and stuff at the top and just a black screen. I was like, what do I do? So I went on file, open, and then there was like this long list of games, and some of these game names I recognized, like Donkey Kong. I was like, what's gonna happen if I double click on Donkey Kong Country?
Right.
And oh my god, the game just starts playing. I was like, wow. I have no idea how old I was though. I reckon probably like 13, 14,
Okay.
maybe. Yeah.
Okay.
Had no idea what like ROMs were at the time or emulators.
Certainly piqued your interest, didn't it?
It was very exciting for me. I was like, I had like this long list of like games all going through my head one by one. Like, oh my god, you can play this again, and oh my god, you can play this again,
Yeah.
and you can play this and this and this.
Yeah.
I was,
And you started questioning yourself, like, oh, can I play this as well?
yeah,
Can
yeah.
I?
It was a really long, extensive list too. This is one of the first times I realized just how far we progressed, like technologically as well. Because I think like ROM is like for the SNES, it's like 3 megabytes or something.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I remember, when I play games on my computer, they're like at least 1 or 2 gigabytes big. That gave me a sense of scale then as well for the first time. I think really like just to understand what difference that was actually in memory, for example. Yeah, it was really exciting time though to be alive, let me tell you.
No, certainly. Did you have any favorite game to play?
uh, well, yeah, all my favorite SNES games, which I hadn't played for like a few years at that time because I didn't have my Super Nintendo anymore.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
sad.
so I definitely replayed Flashback, Donkey Kong Country, Mario. But the cool thing is, like, there were so many where I was like, that sounds interesting. What's that? And like, there was a few that were just in Japanese.
Oh,
Yeah, like Seiken Densetsu and like Secret of Mana, and I was like, they sound interesting. Let me give these a try. And I'm glad I did because they're like fantastic games, honestly.
yeah.
Like great, yeah.
Did it teach you Japanese though?
No, it did not. No. But here's the interesting thing. I think he gave me some copies that had like a fan translation sometimes for the
Oh,
Japanese ones as well.
right.
Yeah. It was crazy. That they taught me a lot about video games.
Certainly. Right. So, today we're not actually just talking about JP's history with emulation.
Boo.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit, isn't it? It's already there. But anyway, we want to talk about the history of emulation itself, focusing on emulators up until the big emulation boom of the 2000s. So basically, from the 90s, or actually entire 90s.
I mean, I don't want it to sound a little bit disappointing, but honestly, when we started this episode, the research for it, I was like, okay, we're gonna go with the start of the emulation, emulators. We're gonna talk about home brewing,
Hmm.
cracking video game consoles, ROM hacks, digital preservation, but that would probably be like a 3 4 hour episode, so it's probably just not reasonable to actually include absolutely everything about emulation. But Player One, guarantee you this is going to be super fun packed episode full of very interesting trivia.
Yeah, true. So, yeah, we're focusing on the emulators itself today and mentioning a lot of the cool ones.
Yes, yeah, with a focus on the NES, surprisingly to me, because yeah, a lot of emulation started properly with the Famicom and the NES, but we'll get into that, won't we?
Yeah, that's true. So, first things first, we need to start with defining, as usual. So, what is emulation? Probably you're aware of this already. Emulation in the context of gaming is playing a game outside of the platform that it was originally intended to be played on. So, for example, you're playing Super Mario Brothers on the NES, but instead of on the NES, you're playing it on your computer or on your smartphone.
Yes, technological wizardry that is. Let me tell you.
Exactly. So that's a very popular example of emulation. But even video games console can emulate games from other consoles. Well, officially and unofficially,
Mm.
like playing Sega Mega Drive or Genesis on your Nintendo Wii is also totally possible.
Yes, I can confirm that is possible. I've seen it for myself.
Yeah, I don't know what the legal implication will be, but anyway,
Very confusing.
very confusing. Yeah. But emulation was not actually invented to play video games. The idea of emulation itself actually is a decade older than even the very first video game arcade machines that existed. The term emulation was actually coined by IBM engineers back in 1963. Yeah, definitely was quite a while ago when computers were still very big, very expensive, and very out of reach for regular Joes like me and you, or Janes.
Yeah, Joes and Janes were not able to afford a computer in 1963. I doubt it.
No, definitely not. I don't think I can even keep a computer in the house.
Yeah, it was. It will probably be too big to keep in the house. It will probably be bigger than your kitchen.
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. And these computers were purpose built for specific use and application dedicated to single tasks. So imagine it if a computer was made to do a calculation, that same computer can't actually be used to draw, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Or if one was supposed to sort out your taxes,
Hmm.
then it wasn't going to be used to help you predict the weather for tomorrow or something. Like they had very specific uses.
Yeah.
They were built for that. And if you wanted, like if your business was expanding to do something different now, you would actually need to buy a full new computer and software for it. Like you couldn't just upgrade your computer like now, like throw some extra RAM sticks and upgrade the CPU and then buy another program. No, no, you have to start right from the beginning and find a whole new computer.
So, yeah, IBM saw an opportunity here and built a hugely influential line of System 360 computers. So, what's this System 360 computers? So, IBM tried to enable businesses to easily expand their computers to meet new and evolving business needs because business needs always grow.
Yes, they always evolve. You might start out as like a little engineering firm needing to do like some architecture drawings or I don't know, like I'm just randomly spitballing here, sorry. But then all of a sudden it turns out like, oh, I need to do like another silly example. Oh, there's like HR stuff now I really need to do, or legal or documentation. And then it's
Mm.
like, you cannot use that same computer. You're gonna have to buy a whole new computer. And obviously, what that means is every time the business is out looking for a new computer, they don't have to buy one from IBM. They can go to any of their
Any other
competitors as well.
companies, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. But I think that's why the System 360 enabled these businesses to start with a cheap model and then build on top of that as their business grows as well.
That's right, that's right, that's right. But how does emulation fit into all this, Gabby, basically? Yeah,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
is there a point to all this business talk?
No, I'm just wanting to talk about like IBM, but no, of course it does. So, IBM engineers had one goal in mind that's not foreign to us gamers, which is backwards compatibility.
Yeah, that's right. So the System 360 computers, they were made for commercial and scientific applications, and they could be upgraded. So if your business needs are evolving or your business is expanding, then you can actually just upgrade, which is really attractive, obviously. But then what happens to all the businesses that have invested a lot of money already on previous IBM computers? Well, for that specific reason, they with the goal of backwards compatibility in mind, they made sure that they could quote unquote emulate the old IBM machines on the new System 360 machines. And they coined the term emulation as part of this as well.
Yeah, so there you go. That's where the word emulation actually comes from. Not from video games, but it's from IBM, from computer world, basically.
Yeah, but interesting to mention is that the emulation happening then is still a little bit different than what we do now mostly,
Mm.
because now we mostly use a program as an emulator. So it's just a program that pretends to be a video game console. But back then, a lot of that was actually hardware emulation still. So you've got a physical device that is mimicking an old device. The vast majority of emulation today is actually software emulation. And this is possible thanks to like how far we've come, obviously, as well. So, I mean, for a PC software to mimic a piece of hardware, you have to imagine that obviously the PC needs to be like a lot more powerful, just to be able to mimic all of the hardware going on, right? But also obviously a lot of like programming and coding geniuses that have like continued to develop on the concept of emulation. So we've come a really long way, basically. Um, Pinning down the very first video game emulator is actually quite difficult, and it is likely that most of these were made just out of like getting a thrill or like out of curiosity, basically, especially once home computers became more of a thing. But also because of like, well, there's kind of a legal gray area a lot of the time too, right? So looking at like the first video game emulators was kind of difficult, but we have found a few possible nominees for the very first emulators ever. But you'll be surprised to find out how late that actually is coming around in terms of gaming history, as a matter of fact. So as we now delve into the first three emulators, player one, just be aware that like maybe none of these were actually truly the first video game emulators.
Yeah, it's just the one that we can find to be one of the firsts.
Yeah, as far as internet research was able to take us, basically. So the very oldest that I could find personally was the Family Computer Emulator version 0.35. And it sounds just as beta.
That's true.
Yeah.
0.35, that sounds like a draft. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely a work in progress, that title, wasn't it? But anyway, this was an emulator for the Famicom, so the Japanese NES, right? And it was a computer program made for the FM Towns computer, which is a Japanese PC made by Fujitsu. So, in this Family Computer Emulator version 0.35, if we believe the file stamps to be true inside of the program, inside of the emulator, it was first released as early as the 12th of December 1990, and it was created by Haruhisa Udagawa, a former developer who worked at Namco and also the Sonic team. So quite a big name here who has potentially given us one of the very first emulators ever. So this version 0.35, it's a bit unknown when this officially came out, but we got the file stamp to kind of indicate when it was released. What we know for certain though is that the final version, which is version 0.45, so that could be found on a CD, the Free Software Collection number 3 CD, which was a collection of free software, just as it sounds,
Mhm.
made for the FM Towns PCs, and that was released in March of 1991. So it's a bit of a mystery if the original version really does date back as far as December 1990, but in any case, as far as we know, this is probably the first emulator, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also only a few months after, to be fair.
Yeah, so in any case, it's a difference of 4 months, and as far as we know, there was no other emulator anyway between this time. In any case, it is very remarkable that it came out this early, as we'll be able to tell once we look at some of the other emulators. Uh, what wasn't very remarkable about the emulator, though, is the actual performance in on itself. Okay, so this wasn't like it can run all your Famicom games and it's going to look really pretty. No, 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 no.
Hmm.
So there was like no sound whatsoever. It ran at very slow speeds, and there was only 5 games confirmed to actually work on it. But they did include Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong, and Space Invaders.
Ah, so all the good ones at least are still in there.
Ooh, be careful with your commentary here.
Well, yeah, I would say so anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're very good games in any case, yeah.
The second one that we want to talk about is actually probably fitting for our game lore episode as well as this episode.
It's a bit of a myth, isn't it, this one?
Yeah, because we don't actually know much about this one. This is also coming out in the 1990, allegedly. It's an unnamed, unreleased, and unconfirmed if it ever truly existed. And it's also for Famicom, basically, and it was supposed to be made for Sega Genesis.
Yeah, so it's a Famicom emulator made for the Sega Genesis, yeah. So run the Famicom games on the Sega, basically, yeah.
Yes, that's true. So Yuji Naka, former president of Sonic Team and co-creator of Sonic, has claimed to have made an emulator that would have played Nintendo games on the Sega console, specifically Dr. Mario. Whether this is true or not, we can't actually say for sure because we've never actually seen any proof of this.
No, and we'll probably never find out at this stage either, I don't think.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how he actually mentioned this several times on interviews and stuff, but it's nothing that we've actually seen.
Yeah, but I mean, he is the former president of Sonic Team and co-creator of Sonic, which that doesn't mean anything. But at the same time, I feel like he probably got like a prototype working and was probably very slow.
Yeah,
But it probably worked, you know what I mean? So I have no reason to doubt him. But like all we can say is we have no proof of it. So you can't say this definitely existed, was never released as such. That's
yeah.
all.
Another thing that we would never find out though is actually Nintendo's reaction if it actually existed.
Well, yeah, but exactly these kind of problems, we will actually find out later, have actually led to something very, very similar with 2 companies feuding like this, eh?
Sure.
But we'll get into that player one, still a while to go. So let's take a look at another emulator now. This one is again for the Famicom, but this one definitely also existed. It was made by Nobuaki Ando in May of 1993, and this one, it was actually able to play sound as well, which is a nice little extra when you're playing games. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
you do want some sound, but unfortunately, apparently the sound wasn't exactly accurate, or was it pleasant to listen to? So there was still a lot of work to do in terms
Okay.
of audio quality.
Fine tuning this thing. Yeah.
Again, still, it's not able to play the entire library of Famicom games either. And also, what was very likely a first here as well, it required a licensing fee and a registration in order to use the emulator. Most notable about Pasofami was that at some time later, the emulator was carrying out piracy checks as well on your machine, because allegedly emulation piracy and that kind of thing was already becoming a bit of a problem. And so this program conspicuously decided that if it finds that you're running a cracked copy of the emulator, it's going to just start formatting your hard drive and just try and kill your computer. Very mean. I don't know how legal that is, by the way, either, if I'm being honest with you. Like, Because
Yeah.
apparently sometimes this would kick off when it was a legal copy too. Like maybe someone put in the wrong registration
Code or
code by
something.
accident.
Oh my god.
I don't know, but like, yeah, apparently sometimes, well, maybe it's just an excuse, like, oh, I never cracked this and it broke my computer. I don't know, but like, yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, imagine if that happens now, where you download the game illegally, like, ooh, let's play, I don't know, Assassin's Creed, and then all of a sudden your computer just like gives up, blows up. Yeah, you'd be upset.
Yeah, I would be. I'd sue them.
Especially if you bought it legally and then it breaks your computer.
I know. Like, why?
Yeah, crazy. Anyway, the emulator was released 2 years later for the Windows 95 as well, but it was quickly overshadowed by other more friendly emulators that were popping up for the NES as well. And they didn't need a registration fee, and they wouldn't kill your computer. I should probably mention as well, really quickly. So we've been focusing a lot on Famicom slash NES at the moment, right? And of course, there was emulation happening elsewhere too for other video game platforms. So, for example, home computers emulating other computers, that was also achieved before the 90s. So, emulators were around, for example, that could emulate the Commodore 64 on the BBC computers and the Amiga computer as well. So, to me, doing my research, it seemed very surprising that game emulation really seems to have started as late as the early 90s. So, for example, surprisingly, we've completely skipped over the Atari 2600.
Yeah, that's true. Are we
Yeah.
just focusing on like the third generation of
Y-
game?
yeah, so here's the thing. So I think the reason that this has happened mainly is like, well, a combination of a few things. Firstly, you need to get a good, powerful computer
Hmm.
and enough enthusiasts and tinkerers to actually try and emulate a video game console. But then also, on the other hand, it's quickly to forget, I believe, we weren't around at the time, how much more popular, better, and revolutionizing that third generation of home consoles was compared to what came before. Yeah, so if you imagine playing Atari 2600, like, yeah, you got some cool stuff like, you know, Space Invaders, I guess, yeah. But comparing that to like the NES, where you have like, Legend of Zelda, with like story, adventure, and you might play hours and hours and hours on the NES or Famicom, but I guess from what I've heard from people say, you might not actually play Atari 2600 games for like hours on end. You might pick it up for 10 minutes, 20 minutes,
Mm.
maybe an hour or something, but like eventually you would probably want to move on to something else, or you'd switch games, obviously, because they were quite basic and simple games and you were getting bored of the one you're playing, right? So, anyway, NES was massively popular, right? And the computers at the time were starting to get into that level of we could actually try emulate something. So I think that's why a lot of this started with the NES and Famicom, basically.
But yeah, but it doesn't mean that the Atari emulation didn't exist at all. We'll get into that later.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Yeah, Atari emulation did come. That's true.
Eventually.
Yeah, a little bit late. It was a bit of a snooze fest.
That's
Interesting to
true.
know who did it as well.
Why are we foreshadowing? We're gonna talk about it soon.
I know, yeah, in like 2 minutes. Player one. So hold on tight, fasten your seatbelts. You're in for a ride.
But yeah, before we jump into that, another world than NES, obviously we need to talk about Sega. Because yeah, some people also wanted to emulate Sega, not only NES.
Ah, yeah, Sega. There were also people.
Hey, I can see your face. But yeah, the earliest known Sega Mega Drive emulator was developed by the Careless Gamer in July 1994. I'm actually wondering whether they're inspired by George Michael's Careless Whisper.
I don't think so because I don't know what that reference is, by the way.
Wow, it's George Michael. But anyway, this emulator was simply known as Mega Drive. It's written together rather than two separate words,
Yeah,
basically.
like it's a Mega Drive, not Mega Drive. So it's a
Exactly.
Mega Drive.
Yeah,
Mm.
and it was released for the Microsoft DOS. So this Mega Drive, this emulator for Sega Mega Drive, very confusing name, but okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, it wasn't a perfect emulator either. It also suffered from a lot of performance issues. It has no sound.
Not
It
even bad sound, like just no sound, which I guess is better than bad sound. If I,
yeah,
if I picked one of the two.
yeah, I would rather not having any sound at all. You're right.
But if it has bad sound, then you could just mute it. So I guess having bad sound would actually be better. Anyway, I'm digressing.
I would say not really, because this one also ran very slowly. Can you imagine having a bad sound and then it ran really slowly and the
Ah,
sound got glitches? Like,
imagine playing Michael Jackson's Moonwalker on this thing.
oh no, you can't because it's gonna be really slow.
Mm.
Yeah, anyway, it's got a lot of glitches basically, but it remains a technical and early achievement because we gotta give it to them, especially when compared to absolutely no emulators existed for Sega Mega Drive
Yeah,
before Mega Drive.
that's true.
Yeah,
Having a bad product to fill a gap where there is nothing is better than still having nothing.
Yeah, well, to be fair, it didn't have a happy ending either, though,
No,
because it
I did say bad product as well. Like that was very mean of me. It was very rude. I must admit. Like yeah, the Careless Gamer is probably like an absolute legend hero by now, like coding things for like NASA and sending ships,
could be.
rockets to the moon, not ships, rockets. Yeah, and I'm just dissing him like, oh, this is the bad product. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we didn't mean that.
No, no.
No, yeah. Although, I must admit, though, it quickly got discontinued because they lived up to their name to be the Careless Gamer,
Why?
because they lost their source code from a hard drive crash. Backup
Oh.
certainly wasn't a thing, was it?
Okay, okay. Well, then I guess it's obvious why this remained like quite glitchy. Like he lost the source code. He didn't want to start again from the beginning. I can totally dig that. It's cool.
Thanks for you who's been waiting to hear about the Atari stuff.
Ah, finally the foreshadowing. Well, you can loosen the seatbelts again now, player one.
Yeah, just a couple of minutes ago, probably. But yeah, anyway, Activision. If you're a gamer, you probably know Activision.
Yeah, quick trivia: the first independent third-party developer for games.
There you go.
Mm.
They actually released an official Atari 2600 action pack for the Windows 3.1 back in June 1995. So, this one was actually the first Atari emulator, as far as we know, and probably the first official emulation being done by a game developer rather than.
A tinkerer, hobbyist, basically. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, that's true. And the interesting thing to note is that reviews for the action pack were kind of negative or mixed reviews, so I don't know how much it was loved, basically.
Yeah, it was. I mean, mixed would be a very positive way of describing the reviews, if that makes sense. Like I was just being nice when I wrote that. Most people were like brushing off a little bit, like, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's why, though, as you mentioned before, why emulation was mostly being done for third generation console. It's also because of this. When you play Atari games, it's not as exciting. The graphic doesn't look great on emulator either. So I guess I understand people just playing it for the nostalgia effect.
Exactly, yeah. And
Yeah,
that's quickly going to wear off again as well, unfortunately, with the entire 2600 games. Again, I can't speak personally because I never played Atari 2600 as a kid.
yeah,
I had a SNES and I played some NES as well. So I can't get more nostalgic than those two things because I have no personal connection. But I guess you can see as well that like, well, especially when it comes out from Activision, they've had the chance now to just, release the emulator, but also improve the graphics a little bit, add like some little features here and there,
sure.
but it's literally just the Atari 2600 games.
Right, so moving on actually from the Atari stuff, there's something we haven't touched on.
Yeah, that's right. We have missed out arcades so far, haven't we? Yeah, what are arcades doing all this time? So, the most important platform that emulators actually play a role in to preserve video game history are actually arcade machines, just because the hardware makeup of the arcade machines is just so much different than home consoles. And obviously, if you let those things just stand around, they will get dusty and they will break, and then they are gone, and there's not more made either, for some of these. So unless you box them and seal them and store them in like a ice cool chamber or something, these things, especially when they're constantly being used every day potentially over so many decades, they're just going to like break, right? But also they're harder to digitize. Just especially the old ones, they just worked a lot different than modern computers. So early arcade emulation consisted mainly of emulating a single arcade machine. But this changed with the release of MAME or MAME, or I don't even know, it's MAME.
Sure.
So how would you pronounce that, Gary?
I don't know, meme, I
MAME?
guess? Yeah.
But isn't that like, like injuring someone? Like you've maimed them?
Oh
Like
my
so that's
god.
why I didn't want to go with MAME. So I'm gonna go with MAME.
Just MAME, yes.
MAME.
Hmm.
Anywho, MAME, that stands for Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, and it does exactly that. It can emulate multiple machines. And this came out of February 1997 by Nicola Salmoria. Uh, and this is really cool. Its top priority is actually game preservation as well, and the prevention of losing or forgetting games to history.
Mm.
So these people are taking it super seriously. And you can tell in their philosophy as well, because while other emulators, especially later on, we'll get into them, they are mainly concerned about you being able to play the game and it's fun
Mhm.
and it's fast and it's kind of like you used to be able to play them on the original platform.
Yeah.
But MAME, they take the completely opposite approach. They're like, we don't care how playable this game is. If it is playable, that is a nice little side effect. But their main focus is actually accuracy. Like the emulator is very accurate in pretending or mimicking the actual arcade machine because they want to preserve this video game for the future. They're not concerned about you being able to play it on your computer necessarily.
Mm.
And I find that really cool because it puts some real, like, mature seriousness into something that, kind of can get glossed over. Video game preservation is super important. Like, yeah, we can all play Mario, on our computer, and that's super popular. But there's so many small games, that unless things like this happen, they will just, get lost to history, like without a shadow of a doubt, just because they weren't super popular and they weren't made by Nintendo or Sega. So according to their documentation, they can emulate over 32,000 individual systems from the last 5 decades. So big shout outs to Mummy or MAME.
Okay, so now I feel like we've diverted quite far from NES. We've talked about Sega, we've talked about the arcade and Atari. Now let's go back to NES.
Yeah, after all, this is the most popular
Popular,
one to
yeah,
try and emulate, right? So
that's true.
this is a good
Yeah.
one.
We're going back a year before MAME, by the way, because
Mummy.
I'm mummy,
Mummy.
sure. Sure, yes, because MME was in 97, but we're going back to 1996. Quite a lot happening actually in this year, and a bit of developer drama as well.
Yeah, I think 3 emulators in total came out in '96 for the NES, so this is definitely a pivotal moment, or pivotal year, I should say here, for the NES.
Yeah, that's true. So let's start by talking about Alex Karpinski, also known as Lundy, who created the Lundy NES. He, sometime later, also joined by fellow emulator developer called Marat Faizulin. By the way, Marat Faizulin, back in 1995, also released the first Game Boy emulator. Why are we not talking about this?
There's just a lot to unpack and uncover. I mean, if we go through every single emulator year by year, starting from 1990, there's like at least 20, 30. So it's
It's a lot,
yeah, yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Anyway, so Marat joined the project together with Lundy to develop a new emulator called INES, or also known as Internes. But unfortunately, the two developers eventually split, and while Lundy continued to develop the Lundy NES, Marat continued to work on the INES instead. So INES itself actually featured a lot of Lundy NES original design and code, so they're basically similar.
Yeah. Hmm.
But INES was targeting at least 85% compatibility with the NES games library.
Which is a very that's an ambitious goal, mind you, for the time. 85% compatibility. I mean, there's going to be a lot of games out, so you're really testing and tinkering a lot there to get your emulator to work. 85%? Woof.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, while the INES originally started as shareware, it would eventually be sold with a $35 registration fee. Quite steep, I would say.
Oh, especially in 1996, right? I mean, that is a lot of money.
Yeah, and for an emulator as well, actually. But anywho, INES actually stands out for standardizing a ROM format for NES games on PC. So if you see, or if you have an emulator right now, you might actually realize that the format will be .NES.
Yeah,
And
that's right. Mm.
yeah, that actually came from INES. And yeah, they make ROM dumping. So basically, that's the process of grabbing the games file, simpler and more compatible for the future. Also, I forgot to mention before, other than actually sharing the code like Landiness and Ines, Landi actually also contributed the game Genie code to Marad.
Yeah, so the game Genie code, in case you forgot what that was, player one. So that's the real cartridge that you could buy for the NES, where if you plug in your cartridge on top of the game Genie, you can
Yes.
start kind of putting cheats on your cartridge.
Mhm.
So basically, Landi created a feature where you could use the real game Genie codes in the emulated games as well. But yeah, we've talked a little bit about ROMs, so I mean, we should probably start talking about what ROMs are too, because I mean, you can't really talk about one without the other. So while the emulators emulate the game console itself, very much like in real life, the console is kind of useless unless you have some games to plug into the console as well. And that's basically what ROMs are to emulators. So ROM stands for read-only memory, just like in standard computer lingo. It doesn't mean anything different. It's read-only memory. And yeah, although now definitely the easiest way to get them is to find them on the internet, well, before that could happen, someone still needed to get those, NES, for example, get the NES cartridges and grab the game files. And that is a process known as ROM dumping, which it's great that we also have a positive spin on the word dumping, yeah?
Yep.
Because, hey, we all been dumped before, you know what I'm saying? So that's getting the actual game files out of the cartridge. And there was really cool ways that I've seen to achieve this as well. But anyway, yeah, I don't want to get too into it. We're going to digress quite a bit here if we do that, how ROM dumping works. So the INES, it contributed to standardizing that process of ROM dumping, which is great because it means that your ROMs, if you use that way, they're going to be compatible with emulators of all sorts moving forward as well. Super interesting fact, by the way. Nintendo have actually been caught using exactly that NES format, the iNES format, in order to run some games on a virtual console for the Nintendo
Ooh.
Wii. Yes, there was a big hoo-ha about that actually, because Nintendo obviously very against the idea of emulation and ROMs, outside of the walled garden, you might say, I suppose. Yeah. So for them to use some of the things that us emulators have come up with, I don't know why I said us emulators. I've never done such a thing.
Okay.
But yeah, yeah. Even Nintendo stole some of this iNES magic, basically, in the future.
So does that mean they emulate their own games?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Wow.
Completely does, yeah. Imagine that they just sell back to you a game they already made 30 years ago.
Wow. Using INES's format.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
pretty much. Yeah.
So, still on 1996, we have another one that's coming, which is Paul Robson's NESA, it's called. NESA stands for NES in Assembler.
Okay, I thought it was Nessie spelled wrong.
No, it's not.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Anyway, it would be quite easy to gloss over this one, sadly, but we choose not to because this one definitely deserved the mention. Why? It was 100% free. You don't have to pay $35 actually for any registration or whatever. And yeah, the source code was readily available. So if you're a developer, you can easily work on games as how you want it. Another thing that's cool about Nessa, it was also fast, as in you can actually play games properly on it, which is something that was still a little bit unknown at that point.
It was still very trial and error how good a specific game would run on a emulator, but this one was pretty consistently fast at running the games at a good speed.
Yeah, which is great because added with the fact that it had decent compatibility with a lot of NES games, it must have been pretty cool. Although, why it wasn't so popular, I guess because iNES still had more compatibility compared to NESA in the first place.
Yeah, and also it just came out at a really awkward time because it would be very quickly overshadowed by the absolute monstrosity that came out afterwards. Because the next emulator we're going to be talking about actually brings us a lot of that true emulator magic that we know and love emulators for. Yeah, the next one we talk about completely changed the game, and it's hard not to overstate just how cool this next one was. The next emulator we're going to be talking about is, don't laugh, Nesticle.
Okay.
Yes, Nesticle was made by Isa Addis of Bloodlust Software and released on April the 3rd, 1997. And it's going to be very easy for me to explain just why this emulator was so incredibly popular. So, do you remember when we spoke about Mummy, the arcade? Like with their philosophy of like accuracy first and playability is a nice side effect. Well, Nesticle absolutely flipped that on its head. They were going to be using all cheap kind of hacking methods, tools available to them to get the game to run and run well. And what was great to it that compared to other emulators, it didn't need such a really efficient and expensive computer to run. It was
Mm.
able to run on quite a regular or low spec PC actually. And again, this was because it wasn't afraid of using quote unquote cheap hacking tricks in order to just make the games more playable. Of course, that has a side effect that a lot of them are kind of glitchy and they need to be patched up a lot of the time. So it's not going to be accurate, right? But it's going to be playable, let me tell you. And this alone would have been enough to give it a spotlight here. But Nesticle came up with so much more, like true staples of emulation that we really love emulation for, other than just playing old games on a different platform. So, for example, Nesticle, they provided you with save states. So, never mind if the game allowed you to save at any point in time or not. Nesticle did just any time. Even if you're playing Mario or Donkey Kong, you're in the middle of a jump or just before that boss that you could never ever beat, you can save just 1 second before trying him. Nesticle also allowed you to record your gameplay and take snapshots in the middle of your gameplay too. So we got a very early kind of let's play kind of vibe going on here, right? It allowed for graphics to be quote unquote hacked. So you could, put in your own user made filters, for example. So you could give it that old school look with like the scan lines and stuff, or invert all the colors if you really wanted to. Go right ahead and do it. Thanks to Landy from Landiness, it did also have the Game Genie code feature baked into it. What I find really cool as well is that it allowed you to use the NES Zapper gun in a way. So I don't think you could use the actual gun on the computer, for example, but like you could emulate it with your mouse. Also, really fascinating is that according to Spin magazine, um, Nesticle contributed largely to the video game music genre, but not in terms of, making music for games, but making music that sounds like it came out of video games. And Nesticle provided a lot of that. So, just in general, like Nesticle was really good at giving you the power of a computer to play the games too. It wasn't just like, can you play the games? Like, you can play the games and you can actually use your computer to do like a whole nother bag of tricks onto it as well. It enhances the experience of playing these old games rather than just exactly mimicking the experience. So
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, it can't be overstated. Like Nesticle was so cool and it was extremely, extremely popular. And I can see why, absolutely. So Isa Addis, the creator of Nesticle from Bloodlust Software, they also released a Genesis emulator. And just in the same whimsical, quippy humor, they called it the Genesist. Yeah, cyst with a Y, the Genesist.
Yeah.
Mm,
As in spelled with like CYST.
yes.
Cyst. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And interestingly, to hear how this whole Nesticle thing ended as well. So, shortly after the release of Nesticle, Isa Addis actually got hacked by a hacker called Donald Moore, who was known by the handle of Mind Rape from the hacker collective Damaged Cybernetics. And After that, Nesicle's development stopped the following year, sadly.
Oh, that's quite sad. I mean, we're talking about one of the best one here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Donald Moore. So he says it's kind of hypocritical because you're making an emulator, which, let's face it, pragmatically speaking, is going to be used to, run pirated games, like mostly, and then you are, saddened by the fact that someone hacks you for your own inventions.
So yeah, as we mentioned before, emulation wasn't just something that happened only for the NES. But imagine this. Now we're in 1997. That's like a decade and a half after the console itself was released. That's why the NES timeline was a good one to follow for perspective and to observe how emulation progressed overall.
Yeah, in snail pace progression.
Exactly. So throughout the 90s, it seems like it's just starting pretty slow, but now it's actually the time where it started picking up.
Yeah, hot and heavy, as a matter of fact, out of nowhere. I wonder if it has something to do with computer video games as well, because by like the mid late 90s, you get hardware more catered towards like, oh, now we can, play some real good like computer games as well now.
Yeah, we
You know
can
what
do
I mean?
so much more and stuff.
Yeah, we all want to play the Doom clones and stuff.
Yeah, that's true. By 1997, the Super Nintendo had already come and gone, actually.
Yeah, come on, gone. Yeah,
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 literally.
yeah.
And by this time, the N64 is already a year old. And yeah, this is where it starts that emulator wasn't just for something that came out a decade ago anymore. It's able to emulate the current generation of console too. And that will be portrayed really nicely with the next emulator that we will talk about.
Yeah. So the next emulator we'll be talking about, absolutely groundbreaking and very historic, just as historic as Nesticle was, as a matter of fact. So the one we'll be talking about is called Ultra HLE, and that stands for Ultra High Level Emulation. And this was a emulator for the Nintendo 64 that was released in January of 1999. And in context of the Nintendo 64, it will have been around 3 years old at this time. And it was made by the two people called Epsilon and Reality Man. I was expecting to say full names then, but no, this is their handle. So made by Epsilon and Reality Man.
Not real name, by the way.
No,
Full disclaimer.
I mean,
Move on, it's okay.
anyhow, the emulator did take full advantage of modern PC hardware, so like Pentium 2 processors and hardware accelerated 3DFX cards, and this massively helped it with emulating properly too. So it must have been very shocking and incredibly exciting when this emulator came out, especially around this time on the internet. First of all, no one thought that this was going to be possible to emulate the N64, and you also had like quite a few fake emulators online, which were just viruses in disguise. So when people actually downloaded this and tried this out, it must have been absolutely exciting, like similar to me getting my CD from my cousin back then.
Oh, this is something real.
Wow. The emulator, it was the first capable of playing commercial N64 games at playable frame rates. At playable frame rates, ladies and gentlemen. Applaud, because I won't, because it's going to sound terrible on the podcast. And it was the first to do so while the current generation of consoles was still ongoing. As a matter of fact, it would be another 2 years before Nintendo even releases the GameCube, the next in line, right? And anywho, 17 games were playable on the emulator at the time of release, which doesn't sound like much, but this included the really big heavy hit titles that probably everyone was dying to play anyway. So, for example, Mario 64, Mario Kart, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and many more. Interestingly enough, as well, even at the time of release, it was probably able to make them look even better than the N64 could as well. So the N64 could display resolutions of up to 640 by 480, but this was quite uncommon. So the N64 was capable of this, but few games actually took advantage of that fully. It was always a trade-off between frame rate and resolution, just like it still is now.
Yeah.
Most games played at around 320 by 240. So Mario 64, for example, had exactly that resolution as well. But the emulator, provided that your computer is good enough, can actually blow this up all the way to 1024 by 768, which that's very impressive. It's like 3 times the resolution, yeah. If you think about that, yeah, that's incredible. That's like a lot higher def. I mean, it's not HD, but it's high def. But you know what? It was only a matter of hours after its release that the emulator would be taken down by the developers due to high demand, as they call it. But I feel like what was really happening is that like they didn't expect the amount of demand that was being put on this emulator. I mean, they're gonna be able to see how much downloads this program is getting, and they were probably a little bit like, we could get in some serious trouble. I mean, there's like thousands downloading this right now.
I
Let's
thought you were
take it
gonna be
down.
happy if someone, wants your product.
Yeah, but I can also see if they're smart enough, they also realize that like if enough people have downloaded this, people will circulate it around anyway. Like they don't need to download it from me.
Fair point.
It's gonna get shared around on the internet, even if we didn't want it to happen. You know what I mean? But anyway, so a couple of hours later, yeah, they took down their own download from the website, and Nintendo, of course, reacted very, very quickly, and only a few days later threatened legal action. But they wouldn't actually end up pursuing legal action in the end, as, like I said, they actually took down the download from their website. But also, they realized it might be very cost and time intensive to even track these two people down to find out, who it is they actually need to sue, as a matter of fact.
But Ultra actually wasn't the only one. So, around the same month, in the same year, in 1999, there was another emulator called the Connectix Virtual Game Station. So, this one was made by Aaron Giles for Connectix, as the name says, Connectix Virtual Game Station, which played PlayStation games. And actually, you can play PlayStation games on Macs, which is pretty cool. But later on, they actually created the Windows version as well. But anyway, first time they released it was for Macs. Aaron Giles was not a newcomer to emulation world or the games world. He previously worked for MAME, or JP kept saying Mummy,
Mummy.
basically, he had the arcade emulator, and also he worked for LucasArts previously. The cool thing about this virtual game station, though, it was presented to the world by no other than Steve Jobs himself doing the Macworld presentation.
Yeah, and what a presentation it was. I think the crowd went really wild when when Steve Jobs announced, we have one of the best computers. This is one of the best video game consoles, one
Yeah.
of the most popular. What if we combine them? And people went crazy. They were like, you could see the smile on Steve Jobs' face. He was like, "Oh, I knew I would get these people engaged once I tell them they can play video games
I
on
know.
on Apple."
But yeah, so VGS supported the majority of the PlayStation library and actually could run at full speed, or at least that's how it was being advertised. Although, in all honesty, when they showed the demo, it was a little bit having like frame rate issue. But
Not consistently though.
not
There was like
consistently.
a stutter where nothing moves for half a second, and then it is playable again. But there's like the occasional little stutter, I guess.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is like when
Mm.
you play games on PlayStation 1,
Yeah.
basically, it also happened.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I get you. Yeah, yeah. It
So
wasn't.
it's kind of the same thing.
It wasn't a very smooth experience as with PlayStation One always.
Exactly.
That's true.
Yes. But yeah, this actually showcased how quickly emulation was progressing and catching up to the consoles at that time. Kind of seemingly out of nowhere because that's like in 1999 and PlayStation just kind of got big around that time, although it was released years before. But you know the dual analog was just introduced like the year before,
Yeah, I think
2019.
so. Yeah, yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Mm, it is true, especially again if we like swivel back again. So like the Famicom NES came out in I think 83, right? And then it took it until 1997 for there to be an incredibly popular and feature-heavy emulator like Nesticle, right? And then all of a sudden, 2 years later, you get both current-gen consoles, N64 and PlayStation, and you got two emulators right there who can play the games of the current gen at like playable speeds consistently. That is seemingly out of nowhere, especially because they both came out in the same month as well.
Yeah. So yeah, it would have certainly been such an attractive buy though for people who are using Mac, gamers who are having Mac at their house, or for regular people who all of a sudden being interested in playing games, being able to play the entire library of PlayStation games with just paying $49, a lot cheaper than buying the console itself.
Oh yeah, $49 is definitely a lot cheaper than a full-blown console. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. But probably you have a question in mind right now, player one. How did Sony feel about this?
Spoiler alert, not very well.
Not very well, yeah, definitely not. Because they later sued Connectix shortly after hearing about the announcement. I mean, it was a full blown announcement during Macworld presentation. So I would imagine Sony knew about it.
It must have been a jaw-dropping moment for them at the office the next day, like,
Like,
oh.
did you hear about that? Yeah.
And then Steve Jobs just smiling at the cheering he's getting from the crowd.
I
Steve
know.
Jobs is like, ha, ha, I am the Master Chief villain.
I sympathize with PlayStation at this point, to be honest, because they probably didn't know that it was coming, and all of a sudden they just knew it from a presentation. But anywho, Sony was actually able to stop Connectix from selling the virtual game station while the court case itself was still ongoing. But at the end of the day, Connectix actually won the lawsuit and were free to release and sell the virtual game station. So well done. That was great.
Yeah, good job, Connectix, for winning the lawsuit.
Yeah, actually, Connectix need to say thanks to the Sega versus Accolade case back from the 1992. So that was 7 years before that, where it was ruling that reverse engineering is considered legal and fair use. And based on that, Connectix actually got away and deemed legally okay to release Virtual Game Station.
Yeah, so that Sega vs. Accolade case, I'm not gonna delve too hard into it, but basically Sega also had like the whole thing going on where you can only play the Sega games on the Sega console.
Yes.
Yeah, but then Accolade, they reverse engineered the console in order to get the games working on it anyway, and also to ditch the Sega boot up logo at the start so the trademark wouldn't be infringed and what have you.
Yes.
And yeah, basically, that's what a court case was about.
Anywho, this Sony versus Connectix actually set further legal precedents that emulators themselves are actually legal, while illegally obtaining ROMs, especially ones you do not own, is not legal. For obvious reason, I would say.
Yes, so having the emulator is okay. Also, selling the emulator is okay, but you downloading ROMs for games you do not actually own, that is not legal.
Yeah, although all of this, it's quite a shame that all this legal case basically didn't happen sooner. Because if you still remember about Ultra HLE that JP talked about before, that powerhouse of an emulator got taken down.
Yeah, for the N64,
Yeah.
like just hours after it was uploaded.
Sony actually announced that it would take action against Connectix literally on the same day that Ultra HLE was taken down by their developer.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, probably the biggest day in emulation history of all time, because it must be, right? I mean, two big things happening at the
Yeah,
same
what
time.
else? Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, we don't even know when the first emulator was made, so this might as well, take it as the most important day ever for
Yeah,
emulation.
but can you imagine though if those Ultra HLE developers would already know the result from the legal debate, basically?
Yeah, they would probably feel like, oh, it's okay, because, I mean, yeah, it's legal.
Unfortunately, though, Sony actually changed strategy and instead of battling for copyright or patent infringement lawsuits, decided it would be easier and cheaper to just buy the emulator from Connectix Classic. And they did exactly that in March 2001, so that's 2 years after the emulator was released. And you know what? Surprise, surprise, or not really surprise, surprise, they decided to discontinue VGS shortly afterwards.
Yeah, no big surprise there. Yeah, well, let's talk about one more as a little bit of a bonus. One more emulator. This one's pretty cool too. Let's take a look at Bleem with an exclamation mark. Before we wrap up this episode, Player One. So, it was released commercially in March '99, and so in fact it was competing with Kinetics. The emulator ran on Windows PCs and also the Dreamcast to play PlayStation games.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
Sony had it quite hard, don't they, this year?
Yeah, Sony was really taking it. But Bleem was created by Randy Linden, who was also no newcomer to emulation or games, let me tell you. So he made a Commodore 64 emulator that was published by ReadySoft all the way back in 1988. He, in the following year, also made a version of Dragon's Lair for the Amiga, which is credited for being the first video game running on floppy disks that could display full screen animation and audio.
Wow.
Yeah, on floppy disks.
Yeah,
Like,
that's impressive.
yeah, that is impressive. And also, he was the guy who made sure that Doom gets ported on the SNES.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not to calculator.
No, not to calculator, no.
Okay, cool.
No. So why am I mentioning all this? Well, because I think it's easy for someone to probably think of like Bleem and Kinetics as just companies who try and like take advantage of the emulator situation that's going on and, just take something that isn't theirs and then, sell that to people. You know what I mean? But you know what? No, like all of these people that we've looked at, these are like some real like gamers and also like computer enthusiasts through and through. These guys, are really cool. So I
Yeah.
just want to make sure that, Player One, you are aware they're not taking advantage of a situation. They are people who love games and they want to put them in people's hands.
Yeah, that's true. They just want to make it more available for people. And yeah, I really commend them for that. So,
Yeah.
really cool.
I mean, he made a little Commodore 64 game called Bubbles when he was only 13 years old. I didn't even install a mod yet at that age. Never mind, created a game.
Wow.
Yeah. Anywho, let's talk about the emulator itself as well. So, unlike Kinetic's VGS emulator, Bleem used 3D graphics hardware for rendering, which improved the resolution and filtered textures as well. And despite having a copy protection in the form of a disk you would need to have as well, alongside the download, that was cracked within 2 weeks anyway.
Oh,
So,
okay.
probably not much use anyhow. And even though Sony had already lost their case against Kinetics, they were still trying anyway. They pursued legal action against Bleem. But this time, instead of just simply buying up the company, which is what happened with Kinetics VGS, they instead filed a multitude of patent infringement cases. And each one of them cost $1 million each to defend, right? And they filed so many of these that Bleem was just not able to defend themselves in court and they just had to go out of business because they didn't have the money to defend themselves.
Yeah.
Even if legal precedence was on their side. Yeah, that's a tough cookie to swallow. Kind of ironically as well, funnily enough, in November 2001, they had to shut down the website and they had a picture of Sonic crying in front of a gravestone, basically. And then, well, they had to take that down because of, ironically, copyright infringement.
Are they afraid to be sued by Sega
Yeah.
for the Sonic picture on
Yeah.
their website?
Yeah.
Well, oh God. Okay. Well, it's getting complicated. I feel bad for them.
So, Player One, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Early Emulation History. Please let us know if you would love to hear more about emulation from the 2000s onwards. But let me tell you, it's going to be another big one. Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to uncover. There's so much amazing stuff still to look at. Dolphin Emulator being put on Steam and then not. Do you
I
remember that whole thing?
know, yeah.
Yeah. There's many things that we could still look at. So let us know, Player One, if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. And you need to let us know as well. How do you actually feel about emulation? We want to know. When was your first time being exposed to any emulator? What's your favorite game? So please do share with us, and you can drop us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. And as usual, new episodes of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday. So make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
Get your pen, paper, and dodecahedrons ready for next episode when we look at how Dungeons and Dragons shaped and influenced video game history. See ya!